When my husband, Cameron Whitmore, threw the divorce papers at me across our marble breakfast table and announced he was leaving me for his 28-year-old secretary, I simply smiled and said, "I hope you'll be very happy together." 6 months later, as he sat in his gleaming corner office, signing documents to claim what he believed was his $3.2 million inheritance, I walked in unannounced and placed a single legal document in front of him. "Congratulations on your new life, Cameron," I said calmly, watching his triumphant expression crumble as he read the trust fund revocation notice that would strip him of every penny he thought was rightfully his. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The betrayal that ended my marriage didn't announce itself with dramatic music or cinematic flair. It crept into my life on an ordinary Wednesday morning in September, wrapped in the mundane routine of what I believed was a rock-solid 18-year partnership. I was Victoria Whitmore, wife to Cameron Whitmore, mother to our teenage son Oliver, and until that morning completely unaware that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Cameron had left early for his investment firm in downtown Portland, kissing my cheek with the same mechanical affection he'd shown for the past 3 years. Oliver was at Reed College, studying environmental science with the same passionate determination that had once made me fall in love with his father. Our craftsman-style home in the exclusive Laurelhurst neighborhood sat on a perfectly landscaped lot, a testament to Cameron's success as a wealth management advisor and my careful curation of the image we presented to Portland's financial elite. That morning, I was expecting our monthly portfolio statement from Cascade Wealth Management, the firm where Cameron served as senior partner. It was our tradition to review our investments together over Sunday brunch, a ritual that had sustained us through nearly 2 decades of building what we believed was an unshakable financial foundation. What I found instead was a letter that would change everything I thought I knew about my husband and my marriage. The envelope was heavier than usual, marked personal and confidential in bold red letters. Inside was not our typical investment summary, but a formal notification from the firm's Human Resources Department. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore," it began, "we regret to inform you that your husband, Cameron Whitmore, has violated company policy regarding inappropriate relationships with subordinate employees. Effective immediately, his partnership has been dissolved and his employment terminated." My hands trembled as I continued reading. The letter detailed a pattern of behavior involving Cameron's personal assistant, Adriana Cross, including misuse of company resources, inappropriate conduct during business trips, and violations of the firm's ethical guidelines that governed relationships between supervisors and their direct reports. The clinical language couldn't disguise the obvious truth. My husband had been having an affair with his secretary, and it had cost him his career. I sat in our sun-filled kitchen, the kitchen where Cameron and I had planned Oliver's future, where we'd celebrated Cameron's promotions and discussed our retirement dreams of traveling through wine country and maybe buying that cabin in Bend we'd talked about during lazy Sunday mornings. The irony was devastating. Cameron had built his reputation on managing other people's most precious assets, their financial security and their trust. Yet he'd been systematically destroying our own family's foundation while maintaining the facade of professional integrity. My first instinct was denial. Surely this was some mistake, some misunderstanding that could be clarified with a phone call. But as I reached for my phone to call Cameron, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His wedding ring, the platinum band I'd placed on his finger 18 years ago, was sitting on the counter next to his coffee cup. Cameron hadn't forgotten it in his rush to leave that morning. He'd deliberately left it behind. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was Cameron's cowardly way of telling me our marriage was over. He'd lost his job, destroyed his reputation, and abandoned his family, all for a woman young enough to be our daughter. The man I'd loved and supported, through law school, through the early struggles of building his practice, through every challenge and celebration of our adult lives, had thrown it all away, without even having the courage to tell me to my face. But as I sat there in the wreckage of my shattered world, holding that damning letter and staring at the wedding ring that had become nothing more than a piece of discarded jewelry, I remembered something Cameron had forgotten in his arrogance and his haste to begin his new life. Something that would transform me from abandoned wife to the architect of his complete financial destruction. You see, what Cameron didn't realize in his rush to claim his freedom was that the $3.2 million trust fund he'd been counting on, the inheritance from his grandfather that was supposed to fund his retirement and his new life with Adriana, wasn't actually his to claim. Not anymore. Not after what he'd done. And certainly not while I still held the one thing that could take it all away from him forever. The trust fund that Cameron's grandfather, old Edmund Whitmore, had established 30 years ago contained a provision that Cameron had insisted on, including when we married. A moral character clause that would strip any beneficiary of their inheritance if they engaged in behavior that brought shame to the Whitmore family name. Adultery, professional misconduct, criminal activity. Anything that violated the family's reputation for integrity and honor would result in immediate and permanent forfeiture of all trust benefits. Cameron had been so proud of that clause when our lawyer first drafted it, seeing it as protection against gold diggers and fortune hunters who might target the Whitmore money. This ensures that only people of genuine character can benefit from grandfather's legacy, he'd told me confidently. It's exactly what the old man would have wanted. What Cameron had failed to consider, in his supreme arrogance, was that the clause would apply to him just as ruthlessly as it would apply to any outsider. And what he'd completely forgotten, in his excitement about his new romance and his plans for financial freedom, was that I wasn't just his soon-to-be ex-wife. I was the co-trustee of his grandfather's estate, with full authority to enforce every provision of that ironclad moral character clause. As I sat in our kitchen that morning, surrounded by the remnants of our supposedly perfect life, I realized that Cameron Whitmore was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. When you destroy a family built on trust, you lose the right to benefit from that trust's protection. And when you abandon the wife who helped you build everything you have, you'd better make sure she doesn't hold the keys to everything you think you deserve. The man who had left me that morning believed he was walking toward freedom and financial security with his young lover. What he was actually walking toward was the complete destruction of everything he'd assumed was safely within his grasp. It was time to remind Cameron exactly what happened when you betrayed the wrong woman. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand the magnitude of Cameron's betrayal, you need to understand what we had built together over 18 years, of what I believed was a partnership forged in mutual respect, shared ambition, and genuine love. The Whitmore family wasn't just successful, we were the embodiment of Pacific Northwest achievement, the couple that other families in Portland's financial district looked up to and aspired to become. Our story began in 2005 at a charity auction for the Oregon Children's Hospital, where I was working as a development coordinator and Cameron was an ambitious young financial advisor trying to build his client base among Portland's philanthropic elite. I was Victoria Sterling then, daughter of a prominent architect who had designed half the office buildings in downtown Portland. My family had money, but more importantly, we had connections. The kind of deep-rooted social network that takes generations to build and can make or break a career in wealth management. Cameron Whitmore was different from the other men in my social circle. While they inherited their positions and coasted on family names, Cameron had fought for everything he'd achieved. His grandfather, Edmund, had built a modest fortune in Oregon timber, but by the time Cameron was born, most of that wealth had been tied up in a complex trust structure that required its beneficiaries to prove themselves worthy through professional success and moral character. Cameron didn't just want the inheritance, he wanted to earn it. He worked 16-hour days building his client base, studied for his advanced certifications on weekends, and approached wealth management with the kind of passionate intensity that most people reserved for saving lives or creating art. When he talked about helping families preserve their legacies across generations, his eyes lit up with genuine purpose. I fell in love with his hunger, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to doing right by the people who trusted him with their most precious assets. Our wedding in 2006 was featured in Portland Monthly's Society pages, an elegant affair at the historic Pittock Mansion overlooking the city. Cameron's parents, retired school teachers from Salem, looked slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur, while my family seemed charmed by Cameron's earnest determination and obvious devotion to me. My father, who had spent 40 years navigating Portland's business establishment, pulled Cameron aside during the reception and told him, "You're not just marrying my daughter, son. You're joining a legacy that goes back 4 generations. Honor it and it will honor you." The early years of our marriage were everything I had dreamed of. Cameron's practice, Cascade Wealth Management, grew from a one-man operation to a boutique firm specializing in high-net-worth families. His client list read like a who's who of Pacific Northwest success: tech entrepreneurs from the Silicon Forest, wine country dynasties, timber barons, and old Portland money that had been quietly growing for decades. Meanwhile, I used my family connections and my master's degree in nonprofit management to establish myself as one of the city's most effective fundraisers. I served on the boards of the Portland Art Museum, the Oregon Symphony, and 3 different children's charities. My events routinely raised 6 figures for causes I genuinely cared about, while simultaneously providing Cameron access to potential clients who valued discretion and personal relationships over flashy marketing. We weren't just building careers. We were building an empire of trust and influence that seemed absolutely unshakable. When Oliver was born in 2008, we transitioned seamlessly into the next phase of our perfect life. Cameron's income had reached 7 figures annually, while my volunteer work had evolved into a respected consulting practice that helped other nonprofits optimize their fundraising strategies. We purchased our dream home in Laurelhurst, a meticulously restored 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors, a chef's kitchen that overlooked Mount Hood, and enough space to entertain the clients and donors who had become our extended family. Oliver thrived in this environment of achievement and purpose. He was valedictorian of his private school class, captain of the debate team, and had been accepted to Reed College with plans to study environmental policy. He inherited Cameron's analytical mind and my family's commitment to public service, confident that hard work and integrity would always be rewarded. Our social circle reflected our status and values. We spent weekends at wine tastings in Willamette Valley with other successful couples who valued education, philanthropy, and discretion. Our annual ski trips to Sun Valley included federal judges, Fortune 500 executives, and nonprofit leaders whose friendship provided both personal fulfillment and professional opportunities. Cameron's partners at Cascade Wealth Management trusted us to represent the firm at industry conferences and client appreciation events. The financial foundation we had built was equally impressive. Beyond Cameron's substantial income from the firm, we had invested wisely in Portland real estate, municipal bonds, and a diversified portfolio that had weathered every market downturn since 2008. Our joint investment accounts held over $1.8 million. Our Laurelhurst home was worth $2.3 million, and we owned a vacation cabin at Mount Bachelor that had tripled in value since we purchased it. But the crown jewel of our financial security was Edmund Whitmore's trust fund. The $3.2 million portfolio had been growing steadily since Cameron reached the age requirements to become a beneficiary. The trust was structured to distribute increasing amounts as Cameron demonstrated his commitment to the family values of professional excellence and moral character. Full access to the principal would come when Cameron turned 50, just 3 years away. The moral character clause that governed the trust had seemed almost romantic when Cameron first explained it to me. Grandfather Edmund believed that money should only go to people who would honor the Whitmore name, he told me as we reviewed the trust documents with our estate attorney. He didn't want fortune hunters or people without integrity to benefit from what he'd built. The clause was comprehensive and unforgiving. Any beneficiary who engaged in adultery, professional misconduct, criminal activity, or behavior that brought public shame to the family would immediately forfeit all rights to the trust. As co-trustees, Cameron and I had the authority to enforce these provisions, but the idea of ever needing to seemed impossible. From the outside, we had achieved everything that ambitious young couples dream of. Cameron was respected in financial circles as a man whose word was absolute bond. I was admired for my charitable work and my ability to bring people together for worthy causes. Oliver was thriving academically and socially, confident in his identity as part of a family that valued both success and service. We owned beautiful properties, maintained friendships with Portland's most influential families, traveled internationally, and had built the kind of reputation that opens doors and creates opportunities across generations. The Whitmore name meant something in this city. It represented integrity, competence, and the kind of old-fashioned values that never go out of style. But sitting in our perfect kitchen on that devastating Wednesday morning, holding the HR letter that shattered every assumption I'd made about my marriage, I realized that our ideal life had been a carefully maintained illusion. Cameron had been systematically destroying the foundation of everything we'd built while playing the role of devoted husband and father at charity galas and family dinners. The most devastating part wasn't just the affair. It was the realization that Cameron had been willing to risk everything we'd created together for a relationship with someone who worked directly under his authority. He'd violated every professional ethical standard he claimed to uphold, betrayed every personal commitment he'd made to our family, and thrown away a reputation that had taken decades to build. Cameron had forgotten something crucial about the empire we'd built together. I hadn't just been his supportive wife and social facilitator. I had been his equal partner in creating the very foundations that protected our wealth and status. And now those same foundations, particularly that moral character clause he'd been so proud of, were about to become the instruments of his complete destruction. The perfect life was about to become the perfect trap, and Cameron had built every element of it himself. The HR letter was just the beginning. As I sat there in stunned silence, my phone buzzed with a text message that would shatter any remaining illusions I had about my marriage. It was from Cameron, sent 20 minutes earlier while I was probably still asleep, completely unaware that my entire world was about to collapse. "Victoria, I won't be coming home tonight. Or any night. I've moved out. The papers will be delivered this afternoon. Don't try to contact me. Cameron." No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of 18 years of marriage, of the son we'd raised together, of the empire we'd built side by side. Just a cold, clinical dismissal delivered via text message, like I was some business obligation he was finally getting around to handling. My hands shook as I read the message again, then a third time, trying to process the casual cruelty of it. This was how Cameron Whitmore, the man who prided himself on his integrity and his commitment to treating people with dignity, was ending our marriage. Not with a conversation, not even with a phone call, but with a text message that could have been sent to a subordinate employee being terminated. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:47 p.m., interrupting my attempts to process the morning's revelations. I opened the door to find a courier holding a thick manila envelope marked Whitmore vs. Whitmore, Dissolution of Marriage. The papers inside were pristine, professionally prepared, and devastating in their comprehensiveness. Cameron hadn't just decided to leave me. He'd been planning this for months. The divorce petition revealed the full scope of Cameron's calculated betrayal. He was seeking sole ownership of our Laurelhurst home, claiming it as a premarital asset despite the fact that we'd purchased it together 8 years into our marriage. He wanted exclusive custody of Oliver during holidays and summers, as if our son was a vacation property to be divided. Most audaciously, he was demanding immediate access to the Edmund Whitmore Trust Fund, claiming that his grandfather's wealth was separate property that shouldn't be subject to community property laws. But the document that truly revealed Cameron's character was attached as Exhibit C, a sworn affidavit from Adriana Cross detailing her relationship with my husband. Reading her statement was like discovering that someone had been secretly filming my marriage and editing out all the love and partnership, leaving only a cold business arrangement between two people who barely tolerated each other. According to Adriana's carefully crafted narrative, Cameron had been emotionally neglected for years, trapped in a loveless marriage of convenience, with a wife who was more interested in her charity work than her husband's needs. She portrayed me as a cold, ambitious woman who used Cameron's success to fund my own social climbing while providing none of the emotional support that a devoted husband deserved. The lies were so skillfully constructed that for a moment I almost believed them myself. Had I been neglecting Cameron? Had I taken his devotion for granted while focusing too much on my nonprofit work? Had our marriage really become the empty shell that Adriana described? But then I remembered the morning just 2 weeks earlier when Cameron had brought me coffee in bed and spent 20 minutes telling me about a difficult client situation, seeking my advice on how to handle a family whose patriarch was making financial decisions that would harm his children's futures. I remembered the previous month when we'd spent an entire Saturday afternoon planning Oliver's graduation party, laughing together as we debated whether to hire the jazz quartet or the string trio. I remembered the hundreds of small moments over the past 18 years when Cameron had turned to me for support, guidance, and partnership. The woman Adriana described in her affidavit didn't exist. She was a convenient fiction designed to justify the inexcusable. But the most chilling part of Adriana's statement wasn't the lies about our marriage. It was her detailed knowledge of our financial situation, information that she couldn't have acquired through casual office conversations. She knew about our investment accounts, our real estate holdings, and most disturbing of all, the specific terms of Edmund Whitmore's trust fund. Mr. Whitmore has explained to me the stress he's endured from being married to someone who doesn't understand his family's wealth management philosophy, her statement read. He's told me repeatedly that his wife views the trust fund as her personal inheritance, rather than recognizing it as a legacy that should be preserved for future generations of Whitmores. Reading those words, I felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated assault on everything Cameron and I had built together, orchestrated with the help of a woman who had been studying our marriage like a hostile acquisition target. Adriana hadn't just stolen my husband. She'd been systematically gathering intelligence about our family's most private financial matters, probably for months. Every conversation Cameron had with her about our investments, our estate planning, our long-term financial goals, had been ammunition in her campaign to position herself as his better, more deserving partner. The cruelest irony was that Cameron's own paranoia about protecting the family wealth had provided Adriana with the perfect weapon to use against me. The moral character clause that was supposed to safeguard Edmund Whitmore's legacy from fortune hunters had become a tool for a fortune hunter to eliminate the legitimate beneficiary's wife. But as I sat in our living room, surrounded by the legal documents that Cameron believed would secure his freedom and his financial future, I realized he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. In his arrogance and his haste to claim his inheritance, Cameron had forgotten the most important detail of his grandfather's trust. The moral character clause didn't just apply to outside threats to the Whitmore legacy, it applied to the beneficiaries themselves. And the authority to enforce that clause didn't rest solely with Cameron, despite what he apparently believed. As co-trustee of Edmund Whitmore's estate, I had not only the right but the obligation to ensure that the trust's moral standards were maintained. And Cameron's behavior over the past months, the affair with a subordinate employee, the professional misconduct that had cost him his career, the deliberate destruction of our family, represented exactly the kind of moral failure that Edmund Whitmore had designed his trust to prevent. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Harrison Burke, the estate attorney who had helped us establish our financial planning structure when we first married. Harrison had been Edmund Whitmore's personal lawyer for over 30 years and had drafted every provision of the trust that Cameron was now so eager to claim. "Harrison," I said when he answered on the second ring, "it's Victoria Whitmore. I need to schedule an emergency consultation about the Edmund Whitmore Trust. Specifically, I need to discuss the enforcement procedures for the moral character clause." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Harrison's voice, careful and professional. "Victoria, has something happened that I should know about?" "My husband has destroyed our marriage and his professional career through an affair with his employee," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "He's now seeking to claim his inheritance as if his behavior has no consequences. I think it's time to remind Cameron exactly what his grandfather's moral standards actually mean." Harrison's intake of breath was audible. "Victoria, if what you're telling me is accurate, Cameron may have forfeited his rights to the trust entirely. Can you be in my office tomorrow morning? We need to review the documentation immediately." After hanging up, I walked to our home office and opened the safe where we kept our most important documents. Inside was a copy of Edmund Whitmore's original will, the trust establishment documents, and most importantly, the amendment that Cameron had insisted on adding when we married, the one that gave both spouses equal authority as co-trustees. Cameron had been so proud of that amendment at the time, seeing it as a romantic gesture that demonstrated his complete trust in my judgment and integrity. "If anything ever happens to me," he'd told me as we signed the papers, "I want you to have the power to protect grandfather's legacy just as he would have wanted." What Cameron hadn't considered, in his supreme confidence that he would never violate his own moral standards, was that the amendment would give me the power to protect Edmund Whitmore's legacy from him. As I spread the trust documents across our dining room table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals and made countless decisions as partners, I realized that Cameron had spent months planning what he thought would be his liberation. What he'd actually been planning was his complete financial destruction. The man who had walked out of our house that morning believed he was walking toward freedom and a $3.2 million inheritance. What he was actually walking toward was the discovery that the wife he'd abandoned held the legal authority to strip him of every penny he thought belonged to him. It was time to show Cameron Whitmore what happened when you betrayed the wrong woman, especially when that woman held the keys to everything you assumed was safely yours. The next morning, I arrived at Harrison Burke's law office 30 minutes early, carrying a briefcase full of documents that I hoped would paint a complete picture of Cameron's betrayal. Harrison's office occupied the top floor of a historic building in downtown Portland, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the Willamette River. It was the kind of establishment that old Portland money trusted with their most sensitive family matters. Harrison Burke himself was exactly what central casting would order for a distinguished estate attorney, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from managing multi-generational wealth for 40 years. He'd been Edmund Whitmore's confidant and legal architect, which meant he understood the trust's provisions better than anyone, including Cameron. "Victoria," Harrison said, rising from behind his mahogany desk as his secretary showed me in. "I have to say, I never expected to have this particular conversation. Cameron always struck me as someone who understood the weight of his grandfather's expectations." I spread the documents across his conference table methodically, the HR termination letter, the divorce papers, Adriana's affidavit, and most importantly, Cameron's text message dismissing 18 years of marriage as if it were a failed business venture. Harrison reviewed each document with the careful attention to detail that had made him one of Portland's most respected estate attorneys. "This is worse than I initially understood," he said after examining Adriana's statement. "Professional misconduct involving a subordinate employee is exactly the kind of behavior that Edmund designed the moral character clause to prevent. But there are additional implications here that we need to consider carefully." Harrison pulled out a thick file labeled Whitmore Family Trust Enforcement Procedures and opened it to a section I'd never seen before. The pages were covered with Edmund Whitmore's handwritten notes in the margins, annotations that revealed how seriously the old man had taken the responsibility of preserving his family's integrity across generations. "Your husband's grandfather was very specific about what constituted moral failure," Harrison explained, pointing to a particular passage. Adultery was obviously included, but Edmund was equally concerned about professional misconduct that would damage the family's reputation in the business community. He believed that a man who couldn't be trusted with his marriage vows couldn't be trusted with anyone's financial security. As Harrison read through the relevant sections, a picture emerged of just how comprehensively Cameron had violated his grandfather's standards. The affair itself was grounds for immediate trust forfeiture. The professional misconduct that had cost him his partnership at Cascade Wealth Management was a separate violation. The abandonment of his family responsibilities represented a third strike against the moral character requirements. But the most damaging revelation came when Harrison showed me the investigation protocols that Edmund Whitmore had established for evaluating moral character violations. "The trust doesn't just rely on accusations or allegations," Harrison explained. "Edmund required comprehensive documentation of any behavior that might violate the moral standards. As co-trustee, you have not only the authority, but the obligation to conduct a thorough investigation before making any determinations about Cameron's continued eligibility." This meant I had the legal right to examine Cameron's financial records, his business communications, his travel expenses, and any other documentation that might reveal the full scope of his misconduct. The investigation powers were broad and virtually unlimited, designed to ensure that trust beneficiaries couldn't hide their moral failures behind privacy claims or legal technicalities. "Harrison," I said, feeling a surge of purpose that I hadn't experienced since discovering Cameron's betrayal, "I want to understand exactly what investigative resources are available to me. If Cameron wants to claim that his behavior doesn't violate the trust's moral standards, then he should have no objection to a comprehensive review of his conduct." Harrison's smile was grim but approving. "Victoria, Edmund Whitmore anticipated exactly this scenario. He gave trustees virtually unlimited investigative authority because he understood that moral character violations rarely occur in isolation. If Cameron has been unfaithful to his marriage, it's likely that pattern extends to other areas of his life." Over the next hour, Harrison walked me through the investigation procedures that Edmund Whitmore had established. I could hire private investigators, forensic accountants, and other professionals to examine every aspect of Cameron's recent behavior. I could subpoena financial records, business communications, and travel documentation. Most importantly, I could freeze Cameron's access to any trust distributions while the investigation was ongoing. The power was intoxicating and terrifying. For 18 years, I'd been Cameron's partner, supporting his decisions and trusting his judgment. Now I was being given the authority to scrutinize every choice he'd made, every lie he'd told, every betrayal he'd committed. But the investigation revealed its first major discovery before I'd even left Harrison's office. While reviewing the trust's financial statements, Harrison noticed something that made him frown and reach for his calculator. "Victoria, when was the last time you reviewed the trust's quarterly distributions?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern that made my stomach tighten. "Cameron handles those," I replied. "He always said the paperwork was too complex for me to worry about, and I trusted his management of our financial planning." Harrison's expression grew increasingly troubled as he compared different documents. According to these records, Cameron has been receiving quarterly distributions for the past 18 months, but the amounts are significantly higher than what the trust provisions allow. It appears he may have been taking unauthorized advances against his future inheritance. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Cameron hadn't just been unfaithful to our marriage. He'd been stealing from his own grandfather's trust, taking money he wasn't entitled to receive, and probably using it to fund his affair with Adriana. The man who built his reputation on managing other people's assets with scrupulous honesty had been embezzling from his own family's legacy. "How much?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Harrison's calculations revealed that Cameron had taken approximately $340,000 in unauthorized distributions over the past year and a half. The timing coincided perfectly with when his relationship with Adriana had presumably begun, suggesting that my husband had been funding his betrayal with stolen inheritance money. "This changes everything," Harrison said gravely. "What we're looking at now isn't just moral character violations. This is potential criminal conduct. Theft, embezzlement, fraud. Cameron has been systematically stealing from the trust while maintaining his position as beneficiary." I sat in Harrison's office, staring at financial documents that revealed the true scope of Cameron's betrayal, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about a cheating husband who'd gotten carried away with a younger woman. This was about a man who'd been systematically dismantling every principle he claimed to uphold, stealing from his own family while lecturing others about financial integrity. The investigation that I'd thought would focus on Cameron's affair had uncovered something far more sinister, a pattern of deception and theft that extended back months before he'd abandoned our marriage. Every romantic dinner with Adriana, every hotel room, every gift that had convinced her to betray her professional ethics had been purchased with money stolen from his grandfather's legacy. "Harrison," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "I want to hire the best investigative team that money can buy. Private investigators, forensic accountants, whatever it takes to uncover every dollar Cameron has stolen and every lie he's told. If my husband wants to destroy our family and claim his inheritance, then he's going to face the consequences of every single choice he's made." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Victoria, I think that's exactly what Edmund Whitmore would have wanted. He didn't create these investigative powers to gather dust in a file cabinet. He created them to protect the family legacy from people who would abuse it." As I walked out of Harrison's office that afternoon carrying authorization letters that gave me unprecedented investigative authority, I realized that Cameron had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd assumed that abandoning me would be the end of our story, that I would quietly accept his version of events and allow him to claim his inheritance without consequences. What Cameron hadn't considered was that his own grandfather had given me the tools to investigate every aspect of his conduct, and the more I investigated, the more ammunition I would have to destroy his claim to the Whitmore legacy entirely. The investigation was about to begin, and Cameron had no idea that the wife he'd dismissed so casually was now armed with legal authority to examine every secret he thought he'd hidden, every lie he'd told, and every dollar he'd stolen from the family that had trusted him with their most precious legacy. The private investigator I hired, Elena Rodriguez, was nothing like the gruff detective stereotypes from movies. She was a former FBI financial crimes specialist who'd built a boutique investigation firm serving Portland's legal community. When she arrived at my home 3 days after my meeting with Harrison, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years unraveling the lies that wealthy people told themselves and others. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elena said as we sat in my living room, "I've reviewed the documents you provided, and I want to be completely honest with you about what this investigation might reveal. In my experience, when someone violates trust at this level, they rarely limit their deception to just one area of their life. Are you prepared to learn things about your husband that might be more painful than what you already know?" I thought about that question carefully. The Cameron who had left me via text message was already a stranger. How much worse could it get? "I need to know the truth," I told her. "All of it." Elena's first breakthrough came within 48 hours, but it wasn't through sophisticated surveillance or complex financial analysis. It came through something devastatingly simple. Cameron's credit card statements, which, as his spouse, I still had legal access to review. The statements painted a picture that was both pathetic and infuriating. For the past 14 months, Cameron had been living a completely double life, funded by the unauthorized trust distributions Harrison had discovered. But it wasn't just the financial theft that cut so deeply. It was the intimate betrayal revealed in every transaction. February 14th, 2023, $847 at Tiffany & Company. a diamond tennis bracelet purchased on our wedding anniversary while I was home with what I thought was food poisoning. Cameron had told me he was working late on a client merger, but he'd actually been buying jewelry for Adriana while I spent our anniversary alone, wondering why my husband seemed so distant lately. March 18, 2023, $1,200 at the Heathman Hotel's restaurant and bar. I remembered that date clearly because it was the night of Oliver's spring break visit home. Cameron had claimed he had an emergency client dinner that couldn't be rescheduled, leaving me to have dinner alone with our son while he was actually in a romantic restaurant with his secretary just 10 blocks from our house. April 22, 2023, $3,400 at a boutique travel agency specializing in couples retreats. The destination was clear from the vendor description: Napa Valley, the wine country retreat that Cameron and I had been planning to take for our upcoming anniversary. Instead, he'd taken our dream vacation with Adriana, using stolen money to create romantic memories in the place we'd talked about visiting together for years. But the transaction that truly shattered whatever remained of my heart was from just 6 weeks ago. $275 at Powell's Books, followed immediately by $89 at a coffee shop in the Pearl District. The amount was so small compared to the hotel bills and jewelry purchases that I almost missed its significance. Then I remembered. 6 weeks ago was when Cameron had supposedly gone to Powell's to buy books for a client's daughter who was starting college. He'd come home with a signed first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird and told me this elaborate story about helping a client find the perfect graduation gift. I'd been so proud of his thoughtfulness, his attention to the kind of personal details that made him such a trusted advisor. But the credit card statement revealed the truth. Cameron hadn't been buying books for a client's daughter. He'd been taking Adriana on a literary date to Portland's most famous bookstore, probably sharing coffee and browsing books together like young lovers discovering each other's intellectual interests. The betrayal of that memory was more devastating than all the expensive gifts and luxury hotel stays. Powell's Books was where Cameron and I had spent our third date 18 years ago, wandering through the stacks and talking about our favorite authors until the store closed around us. It was one of our special places, a touchstone of our early romance that we'd revisited countless times throughout our marriage. Cameron had taken that sacred space, that piece of our history, and shared it with Adriana. He'd turned one of our most precious memories into just another venue for his affair. Elena found me crying over the credit card statements when she arrived for our follow-up meeting. Instead of offering empty comfort, she sat down across from me and said something that changed my entire perspective on what we were discovering. "Mrs. Whitmore, I know this hurts, but every one of these transactions is evidence of Cameron's systematic violation of the moral character clause. He wasn't just having an affair, he was using stolen trust money to finance a relationship that directly violated his grandfather's ethical standards. This isn't just personal betrayal, it's documented criminal conduct." She was right, but Elena's next discovery made Cameron's credit card infidelity seem almost innocent by comparison. Using her contacts in the banking industry, she'd traced the unauthorized trust distributions to a separate account that Cameron had opened 6 months earlier, an account I'd never known existed. "The account is jointly held," Elena explained, spreading bank statements across my kitchen table. "Cameron Whitmore and Adriana Cross, both with full signatory authority and debit card access. Your husband didn't just steal money from the trust to fund his affair. He gave his mistress direct access to your family's inheritance." The joint account statements revealed a level of financial intimacy that was more shocking than any romantic gesture. Adriana hadn't just been the recipient of Cameron's stolen generosity, she'd been an active participant in spending money that rightfully belonged to the Whitmore family legacy. Her transactions were as revealing as Cameron's had been: thousands of dollars in designer clothing purchases, expensive spa treatments, a monthly payment to a high-end gym that cost more than most people's rent. But what truly enraged me were the smaller, more personal expenses. $200 at a pet store for supplies that suggested she'd adopted a dog with Cameron, $150 at a home improvement store for what looked like apartment decorating expenses. Adriana wasn't just having an affair with my husband. She was building a domestic life with him, using stolen money to create the kind of comfortable shared existence that I'd thought was exclusively ours. The most damning evidence came from a series of automatic payments that had been set up from the joint account. Every month, $2,800 went directly to the rent for the downtown apartment that Elena had discovered was registered under both their names. Cameron wasn't just funding his affair, he'd established a completely separate household, a parallel life that existed alongside our marriage. "How long has this been going on?" I asked Elena, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Based on the account opening date and the first transactions, at least 14 months, she replied. "But there are earlier cash withdrawals from Cameron's business accounts that suggest the relationship could have started even before that." 14 months. While I'd been planning Oliver's graduation party, supporting Cameron through what I thought was work stress, and maintaining our social commitments, he'd been systematically building a new life with someone else. Every family dinner, every charity event, every quiet evening at home had been a performance, delivered by a man who was counting the hours until he could return to his real relationship. But Elena wasn't finished with her discoveries. The investigation had revealed something that transformed Cameron's betrayal from a personal failing into a potential federal crime. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elena said carefully, "I need to show you something that might require us to involve law enforcement. Some of the expenses on this joint account appear to be business-related: client entertainment, professional development courses, even what looks like continuing education credits required for maintaining financial advisory licenses." The implication was staggering. Cameron hadn't just been stealing trust money to fund his personal relationship with Adriana. He'd been using stolen inheritance funds to cover legitimate business expenses, essentially subsidizing his professional activities with money that belonged to his family's legacy. "This is tax fraud," Elena continued. "Business expense deductions claimed on money that was never legitimate business income. The IRS will be very interested in reviewing Cameron's returns for the past 2 years." As I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of Cameron's systematic betrayal, I realized that my husband hadn't just broken our marriage vows. He'd violated every ethical standard he claimed to uphold, stolen from the family legacy he was supposed to protect, and committed multiple federal crimes in the process of funding his affair. The man I'd loved and trusted for 18 years had been living a lie so comprehensive that our entire marriage had become nothing more than a cover story for his real life with Adriana Cross. But Cameron had made one critical error in his elaborate deception. Every transaction, every lie, every stolen dollar was documented in records that Elena could trace, and that Harrison Burke could present to the court as evidence of moral character violations. Cameron thought he'd been clever in hiding his betrayal. What he'd actually done was create a paper trail that would destroy any claim he might have to the Whitmore family inheritance. Elena's most devastating discovery came during her 3rd week of investigation, hidden in a place I never would have thought to look: Cameron's abandoned home office. After he'd moved out so abruptly, he'd left behind his personal computer, apparently confident that his password protection would keep his secrets safe. What Cameron hadn't counted on was Elena's expertise in digital forensics and her network of technical specialists who could crack passwords that weren't as sophisticated as their users believed. "Victoria," Elena said when she called me at 7 in the morning, her voice tight with a mixture of professional excitement and personal outrage, "I need you to sit down. What I found on Cameron's computer changes everything we thought we knew about his motivations." When Elena arrived at my house an hour later, she carried a laptop and a thick folder of printed documents. But it was the expression on her face that prepared me for something far worse than credit card statements or joint bank accounts. "Your husband's betrayal wasn't impulsive or emotional," Elena began, opening the laptop to reveal dozens of email folders organized with the systematic precision I recognized as Cameron's professional methodology. "This was a calculated, long-term strategy designed to extract maximum financial benefit from your marriage before discarding you entirely. The emails Elena had recovered painted a picture of manipulation so comprehensive and cold-blooded that it made Cameron's affair seem almost secondary to his real agenda. The correspondence wasn't just romantic messages between lovers. It was strategic planning between conspirators who viewed our marriage as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. The earliest emails dated back 22 months, nearly 2 years before Cameron had walked out of our house. They began as seemingly innocent workplace exchanges between Cameron and Adriana about client scheduling and administrative matters. But even in those early messages, I could see the foundation being laid for something darker. "I appreciate how efficiently you handled the complex client files," Cameron had written in one of the first personal messages. "It's refreshing to work with someone who understands the nuances of wealth management without needing constant explanation." The subtle dig at my supposed financial naivete was carefully planted, establishing a narrative that would justify his later actions. Adriana's responses revealed a woman who was far more calculating than the love-struck secretary portrayed in the divorce papers. "I've always been fascinated by generational wealth structures," she replied. "The psychological dynamics of family money are so complex. I imagine someone in your position faces unique challenges that people outside these circles couldn't possibly understand." Reading those exchanges, I realized that Adriana hadn't stumbled into an affair with my husband. She'd identified him as a target, someone whose family wealth and personal vulnerabilities could be exploited for her benefit. The seduction had been professional from the beginning. But the emails that truly revealed the scope of their conspiracy were hidden in a folder labeled Future Planning, messages that documented their systematic strategy for dismantling my marriage and claiming the Whitmore inheritance. "The trust provisions are more complex than I initially realized," Cameron had written 8 months ago. "Victoria's position as co-trustee gives her more authority than I'd like, but there are ways to work around that if we're strategic about timing and documentation." Adriana's response demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of estate law that went far beyond what a secretary should possess. "Have you considered the implications of the moral character clause if your marriage ends in divorce rather than through your wife's violations? The burden of proof requirements might be different depending on who initiates the dissolution proceedings." The casual way they discussed destroying my life was breathtaking in its cruelty. I wasn't their victim. I was their problem, a legal obstacle to be managed and eventually eliminated. Elena showed me message after message, detailing how Cameron and Adriana had researched every aspect of the trust's provisions, consulting estate planning websites, legal databases, and even hiring their own attorney to review the documents that Harrison Burke had originally drafted. "They knew exactly what they were doing," Elena explained. "This wasn't Cameron having a midlife crisis and falling for his secretary. This was a coordinated campaign to position Adriana as Cameron's more suitable partner, while gathering evidence to challenge your co-trustee authority." The most chilling discovery was a series of voice memos that Cameron had recorded for himself, apparently as a way of organizing his thoughts and strategies. Elena played several of them, and hearing Cameron's voice calmly discussing the destruction of our marriage was more devastating than any written evidence. "Victoria's emotional investment in her charity work makes her vulnerable to accusations of neglecting family responsibilities," Cameron's voice said from the laptop speakers. "If we document instances where she chose nonprofit commitments over family obligations, it creates a pattern that supports claims of incompatible priorities." Another memo revealed how systematically Cameron had been manipulating our social interactions. "The key is making Victoria appear out of touch with financial realities, while positioning Adriana as more aligned with the family's wealth management philosophy. Every public comparison should highlight Victoria's amateur approach versus Adriana's professional competence." But the recording that made me physically ill was Cameron's analysis of what he called the inheritance timeline. His voice, calm and calculated, discussed the optimal moment to leave me in order to maximize his financial advantage. "Waiting until after I turned 50 would give me full access to the trust principal, But staying married that long creates too much risk of Victoria discovering the relationship, he mused. The better strategy is to establish grounds for challenging her co-trustee authority while positioning the divorce as her failure rather than my choice. Elena had also recovered dozens of photographs that Cameron and Adriana had taken during their secret relationship. Not just romantic selfies, but carefully staged images that appeared designed to document their supposedly superior partnership. Photos of them reviewing financial documents together, attending professional development seminars, even posed shots at charity events where Adriana wore my jewelry and accompanied Cameron to functions I couldn't attend due to scheduling conflicts. They were building a visual narrative, Elena explained, evidence that Adriana was a more suitable partner for someone of Cameron's professional and social status. But the most damaging evidence was a detailed financial analysis that Adriana had prepared, demonstrating her intimate knowledge of the Whitmore family's complete asset structure. She knew about investments I'd forgotten we owned, understood the tax implications of various trust provisions, and had even identified potential legal challenges to my co-trustee authority. This woman isn't just Cameron's mistress, Elena said. She's been functioning as an unauthorized financial advisor to your husband, helping him develop strategies to maximize his inheritance while minimizing your legal protections. The final piece of evidence Elena showed me was perhaps the most revealing, a draft letter that Cameron had prepared but never sent, apparently intended for his attorney to review. In it, he outlined his complete strategy for claiming the trust fund while discrediting my right to enforce the moral character clause. Victoria has demonstrated consistent patterns of financial irresponsibility and emotional instability that make her unsuitable for continued co-trustee responsibilities, the draft read. Her obsessive focus on social activities and charitable commitments has created a fundamental disconnect from the serious obligations of managing generational wealth. The letter went on to portray Adriana as a stabilizing influence who had helped Cameron rediscover his commitment to the family's financial legacy. It painted their affair not as a violation of moral standards, but as evidence of Cameron's improved judgment and renewed dedication to his grandfather's values. Reading that twisted narrative, I understood that Cameron hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd spent nearly 2 years constructing an alternative reality where I was the villain and Adriana was the hero. Every argument we'd had, every scheduling conflict, every moment of stress in our relationship had been cataloged and weaponized against me. But as I sat in my living room, surrounded by evidence of my husband's systematic campaign to destroy me, I realized that Cameron had made a fatal error in his Machiavellian planning. His meticulous documentation of every lie, every manipulation, every calculated step in his betrayal had created an unassailable record of moral character violations that no court would ignore. The man who prided himself on his strategic thinking had documented his own moral failure so comprehensively that he'd eliminated any possibility of claiming the inheritance he'd schemed so carefully to obtain. Cameron thought he'd been building a case against me. What he'd actually been building was the evidence that would strip him of everything he'd tried so hard to steal. Elena's investigation took a dramatically different turn when she called me at 6:30 on a Thursday evening, her voice carrying an urgency that made my hands tremble as I answered the phone. "Victoria, I need you to meet me at my office immediately," she said without preamble, "and I need you to bring Harrison Burke with you. What we've uncovered isn't just about your divorce anymore. There are other families involved, and we may need to contact federal authorities." The drive to Elena's office felt endless. Harrison had agreed to meet us there despite the late hour, his tone suggesting he understood the gravity of whatever Elena had discovered. When we arrived, Elena's conference room was covered with charts, photographs, and financial documents that looked like evidence boards from a criminal investigation. "Before I show you what we found," Elena began, "I need you both to understand that this situation extends far beyond Cameron's theft from the Whitmore Trust. We're looking at what appears to be a systematic fraud operation targeting wealthy Portland families, and Cameron appears to be just one participant in a much larger scheme. She gestured to a timeline chart that covered nearly 3 years, with dozens of names and dates connected by colored strings. At the center of the web was a name I didn't recognize: Sterling Financial Consulting, a boutique firm that specialized in wealth transition services for high-net-worth families facing generational changes. Sterling Financial is owned by Marcus Thorne, a former estate attorney who was disbarred in California 5 years ago for misappropriating client funds, Elena explained. He moved to Portland and established this consulting firm that identifies wealthy families with vulnerable trust structures, specifically targeting families where emotional conflicts or generational transitions create opportunities for manipulation. The scope of what Elena had uncovered was staggering. Sterling Financial had been systematically targeting families across the Pacific Northwest, using a network of recruiters that included financial advisors, estate attorneys, and even employees at high-end service providers like private banks and luxury real estate firms. Adriana Cross wasn't working alone, Elena continued, pointing to a photograph of a woman I'd never seen before. She's part of a team of attractive, financially sophisticated women who are specifically recruited to form relationships with wealthy men going through midlife transitions or marital stress. Harrison leaned forward, studying the documentation with the focused attention of someone who understood the legal implications. Elena, are you telling us that Cameron's affair was actually part of an organized con operation? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Elena replied. And the Whitmore Trust, with its $3.2 million principal and moral character clause complications, was identified as a particularly valuable target. She showed us internal communications between Sterling Financial operatives that discussed the Whitmore family in terms that made my skin crawl. We weren't people to them. We were assets to be harvested, problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. Target analysis indicates Cameron Whitmore demonstrates classic vulnerability patterns, read one assessment dated 18 months earlier. Recent business stress, approaching 50 with generational wealth anxiety, wife focused on external activities rather than marriage maintenance. Adriana has established preliminary contact and reports high confidence in successful approach. The clinical language describing the destruction of my marriage was horrifying, but the implications extended far beyond my personal situation. Elena showed us evidence that Sterling Financial had successfully manipulated at least 12 other wealthy families in Oregon and Washington, stealing millions of dollars through similar schemes. The Hendersons lost $1.8 million when Mrs. Henderson's brother was convinced to challenge her inheritance through his new girlfriend's legal connections, Elena explained, pointing to another case file. The Patterson family trust was completely dissolved after the patriarch was convinced that his children were financially irresponsible, all based on manufactured evidence provided by his new fiancée. But the most chilling discovery was a series of training materials that Elena had obtained from a former Sterling Financial employee who'd grown uncomfortable with the company's methods. The documents outlined specific psychological profiles of wealthy individuals who were vulnerable to manipulation, complete with recommended approaches for different personality types. Cameron fit their Type 3 profile perfectly, Elena said, reading from a manual that looked like it had been written by psychological warfare specialists. High achiever with generational wealth anxiety, traditional masculine identity threatened by successful wife, approaching milestone age with career plateau concerns. The manual recommended that operatives targeting Type 3 individuals should validate their professional expertise while subtly undermining confidence in their primary relationship, and provide intellectual stimulation that their current partner apparently lacks. Reading those strategies, I recognized every conversation Cameron had described having with Adriana, every complaint he'd made about feeling unappreciated, every comparison between her professional competence and my supposed financial naivete. Our marriage hadn't been destroyed by natural relationship problems. It had been systematically sabotaged by professionals who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push. Harrison's face was grim as he reviewed the evidence. Victoria, this transforms the entire legal landscape. If Cameron was targeted by a criminal organization, he might be considered as much a victim as a perpetrator. But that doesn't eliminate his moral character violations or his theft from the trust. Elena had more disturbing news. The operation is still active. According to my sources, Sterling Financial is currently targeting at least 6 other Portland families, including some you probably know from your charity work. She showed me photographs taken at recent social events, the Oregon Symphony Gala, the Children's Hospital fundraiser, the Art Museum's annual auction. In the background of several images, I could see attractive women who looked like Adriana, engaged in conversation with married men, whose wives were apparently distracted by their hostess duties. Mrs. Whitmore, Elena said carefully, I need to ask you about some of your social connections. Has anyone mentioned relationship problems recently? Any friends whose husbands have been working late more often or seeming distant? The question made my stomach drop. I thought about Margaret Sinclair, whose husband had seemed distracted during our last charity board meeting. About David Chen, who'd been uncharacteristically critical of his wife's volunteer commitments at a recent dinner party. About Robert Williams, who'd made several comments about younger women understanding financial planning better than wives who'd never worked in professional settings. Oh, God, I whispered, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. They're targeting our entire social circle. Elena nodded grimly. Sterling Financial doesn't just want individual trust funds. They're systematically harvesting wealth from Portland's established families, using our own social connections against us. But Elena's final revelation was the most shocking of all. She discovered that Sterling Financial had been operating with inside information about family trust structures, estate planning details, and personal financial information that should have been completely confidential. Someone with access to privileged estate planning information has been feeding Sterling Financial detailed intelligence about vulnerable families, Elena explained. The level of specific knowledge they had about the Whitmore trust provisions suggests they had inside help from someone in the legal or financial community. Harrison's face went white as the implication hit him. Elena, are you suggesting that someone in estate planning has been providing confidential client information to this criminal organization? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Elena replied, and I think I know who it is. She showed us a photograph taken at a restaurant downtown. Marcus Thorne, the disbarred attorney who ran Sterling Financial, having dinner with someone whose face I recognized immediately. It was James Morrison, a partner at one of Portland's most prestigious estate planning firms. A man who'd attended our wedding and had been a guest at our anniversary party just 2 years earlier. Morrison has access to estate planning files for half of Portland's wealthy families, Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. If he's been providing confidential information to Sterling Financial. The scope of the conspiracy was overwhelming. This wasn't just about Cameron's betrayal, or even Adriana's manipulation. We were looking at a criminal organization that had infiltrated Portland's financial and legal community, using our own trusted advisors to identify and exploit vulnerable families. Victoria, Elena said, what we've uncovered here is evidence of federal crimes, conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, potentially RICO violations. The FBI's white-collar crime unit is going to be very interested in this information. As I sat in Elena's conference room, surrounded by evidence that my husband's betrayal was part of a systematic attack on our entire community, I realized that the stakes had escalated far beyond my personal quest for justice. This was about protecting other families from the devastation that had been inflicted on mine. Cameron might have been manipulated into betraying our marriage, but he'd still made the choice to steal from his family's trust and abandon his responsibilities. Whether he was a willing conspirator or just a useful victim, the moral character violations were real and documented. But now, instead of just seeking personal revenge, I had the opportunity to expose a criminal network that was destroying families across the Pacific Northwest. The evidence we'd gathered could protect countless other wives from discovering what I'd learned, countless other trusts from being plundered by sophisticated predators. The question was whether I was prepared to take on not just Cameron's betrayal, but the entire criminal organization that had orchestrated it. The woman who walked into FBI Special Agent Sarah Martinez's office on a gray Monday morning in November was fundamentally different from the Victoria Whitmore who had discovered that HR termination letter just 6 weeks earlier. I carried myself with a purpose that felt foreign yet entirely natural, armed with 3 briefcases full of evidence and a clarity of mission that surprised even me. Agent Martinez was a specialist in financial crimes with 15 years of experience unraveling complex fraud operations. Her Portland field office had been tracking unusual patterns in estate fraud across the Pacific Northwest, but they'd lacked the kind of comprehensive inside evidence that Elena's investigation had provided. "Mrs. Whitmore," Agent Martinez said as we settled into her conference room, "I've reviewed the preliminary materials your investigator sent over. What you've uncovered appears to be one of the most sophisticated wealth extraction operations we've seen in this region. But I need to be clear about what cooperation with the FBI will require from you." I'd spent sleepless nights preparing for this conversation, understanding that once I crossed this threshold, there would be no protecting Cameron from the consequences of his choices. The husband I'd loved for 18 years would face federal criminal charges, but the alternative was allowing Sterling Financial to continue destroying other families. "Agent Martinez," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, "I understand that Cameron will likely go to prison for his participation in this operation. But I've spent the past month discovering that my entire marriage was built on lies, and that those lies were part of a conspiracy to steal from vulnerable families. I won't protect him at the expense of other victims." What followed was a 6-hour deposition that felt like confessing 18 years of willful blindness. Agent Martinez walked me through every detail of Cameron's transformation over the past 2 years. Every subtle change in his behavior that I'd attributed to work stress or midlife restlessness, rather than recognizing as evidence of systematic manipulation. But the FBI wasn't just interested in Cameron's crimes. They wanted me to become an active participant in their investigation, using my position as co-trustee and my connections in Portland's social establishment to gather additional evidence about Sterling Financial's operations. "Mrs. Whitmore, your access to the community that Sterling Financial is targeting makes you uniquely valuable as a cooperating witness," Agent Martinez explained. "But this would require you to maintain the appearance of being unaware of the broader conspiracy while actually documenting evidence of their activities." The role they were asking me to play was complex and potentially dangerous. I would need to attend social events where Sterling Financial operatives might be working, engage in conversations with other potential victims, and even maintain communication with Cameron and Adriana to gather intelligence about their ongoing activities. "Think of it as becoming an undercover asset within your own social circle," Agent Martinez said. "You'd be attending the same charity galas and dinner parties you always have, but now you'd be watching for the warning signs that Elena identified, documenting suspicious behavior, and helping us build cases against the entire network." The transformation from abandoned wife to federal informant felt surreal, but it also felt right in a way that nothing had since discovering Cameron's betrayal. For the first time in weeks, I had a purpose that extended beyond my personal pain. I could channel my rage into something productive, something that would protect other families from the devastation I'd experienced. My first assignment was to reconnect with Cameron under the pretense of discussing Oliver's college expenses and our son's emotional well-being. The FBI? I wanted to understand whether Cameron was a willing participant in Sterling Financial's operation or simply a manipulated victim who could be turned against his handlers. The conversation with Cameron took place at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, neutral territory where we could speak privately without creating suspicion. Seeing him again after 6 weeks of investigation was jarring. He looked older, more tired, but also somehow diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age. Victoria, he said as he sat down across from me, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had once defined him. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this situation has been difficult for everyone involved. The clinical detachment in his voice was heartbreaking, but I forced myself to remember that this man had systematically stolen from his own family while planning my character assassination. Whatever manipulation he'd endured from Sterling Financial, he'd made the choice to betray our marriage and our son's future. Cameron, I want to understand what happened, I said, following the script that Agent Martinez had helped me prepare. 18 years of marriage doesn't just disappear overnight. Was there something I missed, something I could have done differently? His response revealed everything I needed to know about his mindset and his level of involvement in the conspiracy. Instead of showing remorse or acknowledging the pain he'd caused, Cameron launched into a carefully rehearsed justification that sounded like it had been provided by Sterling Financial's psychological warfare specialists. Victoria, we both know our marriage had been struggling for years, he said, his tone suggesting he genuinely believed this revisionist history. You'd become so focused on your charity work that we barely connected anymore. Adriana helped me realize that I deserved a partnership based on mutual professional respect and shared financial goals. Listening to Cameron parrot Sterling Financial's talking points, I understood that he wasn't just a victim of their manipulation. He was an active believer in their narrative. They'd given him permission to abandon his family by convincing him that our marriage was already over, that I was already failing him, that his betrayal was actually self-improvement. But the conversation also revealed that Cameron had no idea his activities were part of a broader criminal operation. When I carefully probed his knowledge of Sterling Financial and Marcus Thorne, his responses made it clear that he believed Adriana's connections were simply part of her professional networking, rather than evidence of organized fraud. Adriana has introduced me to some brilliant financial advisors who understand generational wealth management in ways that traditional estate attorneys never could, Cameron said, his enthusiasm genuine despite being completely misguided. These consultants have helped dozens of families optimize their inheritance structures and eliminate inefficient trust provisions. The recording device hidden in my purse captured every word of Cameron's unwitting confession to participating in what he thought was sophisticated financial planning, but what was actually systematic estate fraud. He was describing Sterling Financial's operations in detail while remaining completely unaware of their criminal nature. Over the following 3 weeks, I attended social events with new eyes, watching for the warning signs that Elena had taught me to recognize. At the Portland Art Museum's fall fundraiser, I spotted 2 women who fit the Sterling Financial operative profile, both engaged in intimate conversations with married men whose wives were busy with hostess duties. At a wine tasting event for the Children's Hospital Board, I noticed Dr. Robert Hayes, a prominent surgeon, spending an unusual amount of time discussing his family's estate planning with a young woman who demonstrated suspicious knowledge of trust structures and tax optimization strategies. Each observation was carefully documented and reported to Agent Martinez, who used the intelligence to identify additional targets and expand the FBI's understanding of Sterling Financial's methods. I'd become a gatherer of evidence against predators who used our own social connections to destroy families. But the role that felt most natural was protecting other potential victims through direct intervention. When I noticed Sandra Williams, whose husband had been showing classic vulnerability patterns, I arranged private conversations where I could share my experience without revealing the ongoing investigation. Sandra, I know this is difficult to hear, I told her over lunch at a quiet restaurant, but I think David might be involved with someone who's targeting your family's finances. The patterns you're describing, the late meetings, the new financial advisors, the criticism of your spending, they're identical to what I experienced with Cameron. These conversations were the most rewarding part of my new role. Instead of just gathering evidence, I was actively preventing other families from experiencing the devastation that Sterling Financial had inflicted on mine. 3 women changed their estate planning provisions based on my warnings, potentially saving millions of dollars from theft. The transformation was complete when Agent Martinez offered me a consulting contract with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, providing expertise on how wealthy families could protect themselves from sophisticated fraud operations. Victoria, you understand both the criminal methods and the victim psychology better than anyone on our team, she explained. Your experience could help us develop prevention strategies that protect vulnerable families before they become targets. 6 weeks after discovering Cameron's betrayal, I'd evolved from abandoned wife to federal consultant, from naive victim to expert protector. The woman who had trusted completely and been betrayed systematically had become someone who understood exactly how predators operated and how to stop them. Cameron had intended to discard me as an obstacle to his new life. Instead, his betrayal had freed me to become more formidable than he'd ever imagined, armed with federal authority and a mission that extended far beyond personal revenge. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but Cameron still had no idea that the wife he'd abandoned was now the instrument of his complete destruction. The opportunity to trap Cameron came from the most unlikely source: his own arrogance and desperate need for validation. 2 months after becoming an FBI informant, I received a phone call that would provide the perfect setting for his complete destruction. Victoria, came the familiar voice of Patricia Morrison, president of the Portland Estate Planning Council. I have an unusual request that I hope you'll consider. The Portland Estate Planning Council was the city's most prestigious organization for wealth management professionals, a group that Cameron had desperately wanted to join for years, but had never quite achieved the status to warrant invitation. Their annual Excellence in Fiduciary Services Award was considered the highest honor in Portland's financial community. We're facing an unprecedented situation, Patricia continued, her voice carrying the weight of institutional crisis. This year's award recipient, Thomas Berkeley, has been forced to withdraw due to a family medical emergency. The ceremony is in 3 weeks, and we need to select an alternate recipient immediately. My heart began racing as I understood the implications. The ceremony would be attended by every significant figure in Portland's financial and legal establishment. Exactly the kind of high-profile venue where Cameron would be unable to resist making an appearance, especially if he believed he might be considered for recognition. Patricia, I appreciate you thinking of the Whitmore family, I said carefully, but given Cameron's recent personal challenges, I'm not sure this is the right time. Actually, Victoria, that's exactly why we're calling, Patricia replied. The selection committee has reviewed Cameron's professional accomplishments, and despite his recent difficulties, his expertise in generational wealth management remains exemplary. We'd like to present him with the award, partly as recognition of his contributions and partly as a gesture of professional support during his personal transition. The irony was breathtaking. Portland's estate planning establishment wanted to honor Cameron for his integrity and professional excellence, at the exact moment when federal agents were building a criminal case against him. But more importantly, the ceremony would provide the ideal setting for his public exposure and arrest. I immediately called Agent Martinez to discuss the opportunity. Her enthusiasm was immediate and strategic. Victoria, this is perfect, she said. A high-profile ceremony with media coverage and all of Portland's financial elite in attendance. It's exactly the kind of public forum where Cameron's arrest would have maximum impact and send the strongest possible message to Sterling Financial's other operatives. But Agent Martinez had an even more sophisticated plan in mind. Rather than simply arresting Cameron at the ceremony, she wanted to use the event as the culmination of a coordinated operation that would dismantle Sterling Financial's entire Portland network simultaneously. We've been tracking 6 active Sterling Financial operations targeting Portland families, she explained. If we coordinate properly, we can arrest Marcus Thorne, Adriana Cross, and at least 4 other operatives during the same evening, while also executing search warrants at Sterling Financial's offices and James Morrison's law firm. The plan was elegant in its symmetry. While Cameron stood on stage accepting an award for fiduciary excellence, federal agents would be arresting his criminal associates and seizing evidence that would destroy any remaining pretense about the nature of his activities. But my role in the trap would be more complex than simply attending the ceremony. Agent Martinez wanted me to personally ensure that Cameron would accept the award and attend the event, which meant I needed to overcome any suspicions he might have about my motivations. "You'll need to make Cameron believe that accepting this award serves his interests," Agent Martinez said. "He needs to think that public recognition will help rehabilitate his professional reputation and strengthen his position in the divorce proceedings." The conversation with Cameron required every skill I developed as an undercover informant. I met him at his downtown apartment, a sterile corporate housing unit that felt more like a hotel room than a home. The contrast with our warm, lived-in house in Laurelhurst was stark and somehow fitting. "Cameron," I began, following the script Agent Martinez had helped me develop, "I received a call from Patricia Morrison at the Estate Planning Council. They want to present you with the Excellence in Fiduciary Services Award." His reaction was immediate and revealing. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite his betrayal and abandonment of our family, Cameron's face lit up with genuine excitement. The award represented everything he'd worked toward professionally, validation from the very establishment he'd spent his career trying to impress. "Are you serious?" he asked, his composure cracking for the first time since our divorce proceedings began. "The Excellence Award? That's the most prestigious recognition in our field." "I know how much this means to you," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "Despite our personal problems, I've never questioned your professional competence. This award acknowledges what you've accomplished in wealth management." But Cameron's excitement was immediately tempered by suspicion. He'd grown paranoid during his months with Sterling Financial's operatives, constantly worried about threats to his plans that he couldn't quite identify. "Victoria, why are you telling me this? Given everything that's happened between us, I would have expected you to try to interfere with any professional recognition I might receive." This was the crucial moment. I needed to provide a motivation that Cameron would find believable, while ensuring he would attend the ceremony without suspicion. "Cameron, Oliver is watching how we handle this divorce," I said, allowing real emotion to enter my voice. "Our son has been devastated by our separation, and he's struggling to understand why his father would abandon the family. If you receive this professional recognition, it might help Oliver maintain some pride in the Whitmore name, even if our marriage is over." The manipulation was perfect because it contained enough truth to be convincing. Oliver had indeed been struggling with Cameron's abandonment, though he'd been far more supportive of my decisions than Cameron knew. But appealing to Cameron's residual parental guilt was exactly the right approach. "I want our son to see that his father is still respected professionally," I continued. "This award might help Oliver understand that sometimes good people make personal mistakes without losing their essential character." Cameron's expression softened in a way I hadn't seen since before Adriana had entered our lives. For a moment, he looked like the man I'd fallen in love with 18 years earlier, someone who genuinely cared about his family's well-being despite his catastrophic personal choices. "You really think this would help Oliver cope with the divorce?" he asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made my heart ache despite everything he'd done. "I think Oliver needs to see his father honored for his professional achievements," I replied. "It might help him separate your personal decisions from your professional integrity." Cameron agreed to accept the award, but he had one condition that nearly derailed our carefully constructed trap. "Victoria, I want Adriana to attend the ceremony with me," he said. "She's been incredibly supportive during this difficult period, and I think it's time for Portland's professional community to meet the woman who will be part of my future." The request was simultaneously perfect and terrifying. Perfect because it would ensure that Adriana would be present for her arrest, completing the FBI's plan to dismantle Sterling Financial's local operations. Terrifying because it meant I would have to sit through an entire evening watching my husband's mistress receive the social recognition that should have been mine. "If that's what you want, Cameron," I managed to say, "then I think Patricia Morrison can arrange additional seating." Agent Martinez was delighted when I reported Cameron's conditions. "Having Adriana at the ceremony actually improves our operational planning," she said. "We can arrest both primary targets simultaneously while ensuring maximum media coverage of Sterling Financial's criminal activities." But the final element of the trap required the most delicate coordination. Agent Martinez wanted to ensure that Cameron's acceptance speech would provide additional evidence of his criminal activities, recorded in front of witnesses who could testify about his state of mind and knowledge of Sterling Financial's operations. "We need Cameron to talk about his new financial consulting relationships and his innovative approaches to estate planning," Agent Martinez explained. "If he describes Sterling Financial Services publicly, it becomes much harder for him to claim ignorance about their criminal activities." The plan was set. In 2 weeks, Cameron would stand before Portland's financial establishment, accepting an award for professional excellence while unknowingly confessing to participating in systematic estate fraud. The ceremony that he believed would rehabilitate his reputation would instead become the stage for exposing his crimes to everyone whose opinion he valued most. The man who had spent months plotting my character assassination was about to deliver the final evidence needed to destroy his claim to the Whitmore inheritance, and he would do it voluntarily, in front of cameras and witnesses, while believing he was securing his professional future. Cameron's arrogance had always been his weakness, but now it would become the instrument of his complete and public destruction. The Multnomah Athletic Club's grand ballroom sparkled with the understated elegance that Portland's financial elite preferred: crystal chandeliers, mahogany paneling, and fresh orchids at every table. 200 of the city's most prominent estate attorneys, wealth managers, and financial advisors had gathered to celebrate excellence in fiduciary services, completely unaware they were about to witness the most spectacular professional downfall in Portland's history. I sat at table 3, wearing the same navy blue dress I'd worn to our anniversary party 2 years earlier, when Cameron had been charming potential victims while I played the role of devoted wife. Tonight, that same dress would witness his complete destruction. Across the room, federal agents posed as waitstaff and photographers, their positions carefully coordinated to ensure perfect documentation of Cameron's arrest. Agent Martinez had briefed me on the evening's timeline with military precision. Cameron would give his acceptance speech at 8:30, during which he would unknowingly confess to participating in Sterling Financial's operations. At 8:45, while he was still on stage basking in applause, federal agents would simultaneously arrest Marcus Thorne at his downtown office, James Morrison at his home, and execute search warrants at Sterling Financial's headquarters. Cameron's arrest would occur at precisely 8:47, after his speech, but before he could leave the podium. The timing would ensure maximum witness testimony about his state of mind and voluntary admissions, while the coordinated raids would prevent any evidence destruction by his criminal associates. But watching Cameron work the room during the cocktail hour, I realized that his arrogance had reached levels that exceeded even my worst expectations. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who believed he'd successfully manipulated everyone around him, introducing Adriana to Portland's financial establishment as if she were already his respected partner, rather than his criminal accomplice. "Victoria," Patricia Morrison approached my table, her expression carrying the awkward formality that marked all my social interactions since Cameron's abandonment became public knowledge. "I want to thank you for encouraging Cameron to accept this honor. Despite your personal difficulties, your support demonstrates remarkable grace." The irony was suffocating. Patricia Morrison was praising my grace while having no idea that I'd spent the past 3 months working with federal agents to document my husband's criminal activities. But maintaining the facade was crucial for the evening's success. "Cameron has always been dedicated to his client's financial security," I replied, using words that would be technically accurate regardless of their context. I thought the community should acknowledge his unique approaches to wealth management. At 8:15, Cameron took his place at the head table next to Adriana, who wore a red dress that probably cost more than most attendees' monthly salaries. They looked like a power couple, confident and attractive, completely oblivious to the federal agents positioned throughout the ballroom. Patricia Morrison began her introduction with the kind of glowing professional biography that Cameron had always dreamed of hearing. His accomplishments were impressive when stripped of their criminal context. Advanced certifications, complex client cases, innovative approaches to generational wealth transfer. Cameron Whitmore represents the best traditions of our profession, Patricia announced to polite applause. His commitment to protecting family legacies and his innovative consulting relationships have helped dozens of families optimize their estate planning strategies. Those innovative consulting relationships were Sterling Financial's criminal network, but Patricia had no way of knowing that the glowing testimonials she'd received were from victims who didn't yet understand they'd been defrauded. Cameron's walk to the podium was confident, almost theatrical. He paused to kiss Adriana's cheek, a gesture that would be captured by news photographers and forever associated with his criminal activities. At the microphone, he adjusted his jacket and smiled at the audience with genuine warmth and satisfaction. "Thank you for this incredible honor," Cameron began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him such an effective manipulator. "When I established my practice 18 years ago, I made a commitment to revolutionize how families approach generational wealth management." Listening to Cameron's opening remarks, I realized he was about to deliver exactly the kind of self-incriminating speech that Agent Martinez had hoped for. His professional pride was overriding any instinct for caution. "Traditional estate planning is often too conservative," Cameron continued, warming to his theme. "Working with innovative consulting firms like Sterling Financial, I've helped families break free from outdated trust structures that limit their financial potential." A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. Sterling Financial's name meant nothing to most attendees, but Cameron's endorsement carried significant weight in Portland's financial community. "These partnerships have allowed me to offer clients sophisticated services that go far beyond conventional legal advice," Cameron said, his enthusiasm building. "We identify families whose trust structures contain unnecessary restrictions, then provide the guidance needed to optimize their inheritance potential." Agent Martinez had positioned herself near the ballroom's main entrance, and I could see her speaking quietly into her radio as Cameron's speech became increasingly detailed about his criminal activities. "Just last year, I helped the Henderson family restructure their estate planning to eliminate wasteful trust provisions that were limiting their financial flexibility," Cameron announced proudly. "The consulting relationships I've developed allow me to offer services that traditional attorneys simply cannot match." The Henderson family had been one of Sterling Financial's victims, losing $1.8 million through the restructuring that Cameron was now bragging about to a room full of potential witnesses. He was essentially confessing to systematic estate fraud while believing he was describing innovative professional practices. But Cameron's most damaging admission came when he decided to acknowledge Adriana's contribution to his success. "I also want to recognize my partner Adriana Cross, whose expertise in complex financial structures has been invaluable," he said, gesturing toward her table. "Adriana's background in wealth transition consulting has helped me understand generational dynamics that I might have missed using conventional approaches." Adriana smiled and nodded graciously, completely unaware that Cameron had just identified her as his co-conspirator in front of 200 witnesses and multiple recording devices. "The consulting network that Adriana introduced me to has transformed my practice," Cameron continued. "Working with specialists who understand the psychological aspects of family wealth has allowed me to help clients make decisions that maximize their financial freedom while minimizing unnecessary family conflicts." Those psychological aspects were Sterling Financial's manipulation techniques, and the specialists were criminal operatives who'd been targeting vulnerable families across the Pacific Northwest. As Cameron's speech reached its crescendo, I could see federal agents moving into position around the ballroom. The waitstaff, who weren't actually FBI agents, looked confused by the subtle shift in energy, but the 200 guests remained focused on Cameron's words. "In closing," Cameron said, his voice filled with satisfaction and genuine pride, "I want to thank everyone who has supported my efforts to revolutionize wealth management in Portland. This award validates not just my individual efforts, but the collaborative approach that Sterling Financial and other consulting partners have brought to our community." The applause that followed was enthusiastic and sustained. Portland's financial establishment was celebrating Cameron's innovation and success, completely unaware they were applauding systematic criminal fraud. But as Cameron stood at the podium, basking in recognition he'd craved for years, Agent Martinez stepped onto the small stage beside him. Her FBI credentials were clearly visible as she approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Martinez announced, her voice carrying absolute authority, "I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Mr. Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering." The silence that followed was complete and stunned. 200 of Portland's most sophisticated professionals sat frozen as federal agents moved through the ballroom, identifying other Sterling Financial associates who had attended the ceremony. Cameron's expression shifted from confusion to denial to the beginning of genuine panic as Agent Martinez continued reading his Miranda rights. But it was Adriana's reaction that provided the evening's most satisfying moment. She had risen from her seat and was moving toward the ballroom's exits when 2 additional FBI agents intercepted her. "Adriana Cross, you're also under arrest," one of them announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The woman who had manipulated my husband and stolen my family's money was led away in handcuffs while Portland's financial elite watched in shocked silence." As Cameron was escorted from the stage, he caught my eye across the ballroom. The expression on his face was one of complete bewilderment. He genuinely couldn't understand how his moment of triumph had become his public destruction. But I could see the exact moment when understanding dawned. His wife, the woman he'd dismissed as a naive obstacle to his new life, had been the architect of his complete professional annihilation. The Excellence in Fiduciary Services Award sat abandoned on the podium, surrounded by the wreckage of Cameron's reputation and the shocked whispers of witnesses who would ensure that this story became legend in Portland's financial community. The weeks following Cameron's arrest unfolded with the methodical precision of federal justice, each day bringing new revelations that demonstrated just how comprehensively his life was unraveling. The morning after the awards ceremony, the Portland Tribune's front page featured a photograph of Cameron in handcuffs being led from the Multnomah Athletic Club, with the headline, "Estate Planning Award Winner Arrested for Fraud." But the media coverage was just the beginning of consequences that would reshape Portland's financial community and destroy every aspect of the life Cameron had tried so desperately to protect. Harrison Burke called me at 8 a.m. the day after Cameron's arrest, his voice carrying a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal vindication that I'd never heard from him before. "Victoria, the trust fund provisions are now automatically triggered," he said without preamble. Cameron's arrest on federal fraud charges, combined with his documented adultery and professional misconduct, represents complete violation of every moral character clause that Edmund Whitmore established. The legal machinery that Cameron had forgotten about moved with devastating efficiency. By noon, Harrison had filed the necessary paperwork with the probate court, officially stripping Cameron of all rights to the $3.2 million trust fund. But the consequences extended far beyond simple forfeiture. "The restitution clauses that your husband insisted on including are particularly comprehensive," Harrison explained as we reviewed the documents in his office. "Cameron isn't just losing his inheritance. He's now legally obligated to repay every unauthorized distribution he received, plus penalties and interest." The mathematics of Cameron's destruction were elegant in their completeness. The $340,000 in stolen trust distributions, compounded with penalties and legal costs, created a debt of approximately $520,000. Combined with his forfeited inheritance rights, Cameron had lost nearly $4 million in a single day. But the financial consequences were only part of his systematic destruction. The Oregon State Bar Association moved with unprecedented speed to initiate disciplinary proceedings that would permanently revoke Cameron's law license and his financial advisory certifications. The Bar Association has never seen documented evidence this comprehensive, the prosecutor handling Cameron's professional misconduct case told me during a witness preparation meeting. Between the federal criminal charges and the detailed evidence of moral character violations, Mr. Whitmore's professional licenses will be permanently revoked before his criminal trial even begins. The Sterling financial investigation had uncovered 12 other families across Oregon and Washington who had been defrauded through similar schemes. Each family was filing civil lawsuits against Cameron, Adriana, and the other network participants, creating a cascade of financial liability that would ensure Cameron's bankruptcy even if he somehow avoided prison time. Margaret Henderson, the elderly widow whose family trust had been pillaged through Cameron's innovative restructuring, became the lead plaintiff in a class action lawsuit that sought $8.7 million in damages from the Sterling Financial Network. Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret told me when we met for coffee 3 weeks after Cameron's arrest, "I can't thank you enough for having the courage to expose these criminals. My family lost everything we'd saved over 3 generations, but at least now we have hope for recovery." The Victim Restitution Fund that federal prosecutors established would be funded primarily by seized assets from Sterling Financial's operations, but Cameron's forfeited trust fund provided immediate relief for families who couldn't wait years for criminal proceedings to conclude. "Your husband's inheritance is being distributed to the families he helped defraud," Agent Martinez informed me during one of our regular briefings. "It's poetic justice. Edmund Whitmore's legacy is being used to repair the damage that his grandson caused to other families' legacies." But the most personally satisfying consequence was watching Cameron's social and professional reputation collapse in real time. The Portland financial community that had once respected his expertise now treated his name as synonymous with sophisticated fraud and professional betrayal. Cascade Wealth Management, the firm Cameron had built over 15 years, was forced into bankruptcy within 2 weeks of his arrest. His former partners issued public statements distancing themselves from his activities, but the firm's reputation was irreparably damaged by association with the Sterling financial scandal. Client withdrawals exceeded $40 million in the first week after Cameron's arrest, one former partner told the business press. Families who had trusted us for decades were demanding immediate account transfers because they couldn't be certain which advisors were involved in the fraud network. Cameron's attempt to claim ignorance about Sterling Financial's criminal activities crumbled under the weight of evidence that Elena and the FBI had gathered. The recorded conversations, email correspondence, and financial transactions painted a clear picture of willing participation rather than innocent manipulation. Mr. Whitmore's own words demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the illegal activities, federal prosecutor David Chen explained to reporters outside the courthouse. His recorded statements about optimizing inheritance potential and, quote, eliminating unnecessary trust restrictions are textbook descriptions of estate fraud techniques. Adriana Cross's plea negotiations provided additional evidence of Cameron's criminal intent. Facing decades in federal prison, she cooperated fully with prosecutors, detailing conversations where Cameron had explicitly discussed circumventing legal safeguards and exploiting vulnerable families. Cameron Whitmore knew exactly what Sterling Financial was doing to their targets, Adriana's attorney stated during her plea hearing. "My client's testimony will demonstrate that Mr. Whitmore was a willing and enthusiastic participant who specifically requested training on psychological manipulation techniques." The betrayal cut both ways. Adriana was throwing Cameron under the bus just as enthusiastically as she'd once helped him destroy our marriage. Oliver returned from Reed College for Thanksgiving break and spent hours reviewing the evidence with me, trying to understand how his father had become involved in such comprehensive criminal activity. Mom, I keep reading Dad's emails and thinking this can't be the same person who taught me about integrity and personal responsibility, Oliver said, his voice carrying the pain of disillusionment that I recognized from my own experience. Your father lost himself somewhere along the way, I told him, though I wasn't entirely convinced that Cameron had changed rather than simply revealed his true nature. But what matters now is that justice is being served and other families are being protected. Oliver's response demonstrated the kind of moral clarity that I hoped would define the next generation of Whitmores. I'm proud of what you did, Mom. It took incredible courage to expose Dad's crimes, even though it meant destroying our family's reputation. But our family's reputation was actually being strengthened by my cooperation with federal authorities. Portland's financial community was beginning to view the Whitmore name as synonymous with moral courage rather than criminal betrayal, thanks to my role in exposing the Sterling financial network. The Oregon State Bar Association invited me to serve on a committee developing new ethical guidelines for estate planning attorneys, recognizing my expertise in identifying and preventing professional misconduct. Victoria Whitmore's experience provides invaluable insights into how sophisticated criminals exploit client relationships, the Bar Association's Ethics Committee chair explained. Her willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for professional integrity represents the highest standards of our legal community. 6 months after Cameron's arrest, I stood in the same probate courtroom where our divorce proceedings had begun, but now I was there as a witness in federal criminal proceedings rather than as an abandoned spouse seeking justice. Cameron sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, having been denied bail due to flight risk concerns. The confident man who had once manipulated Portland's financial elite now looked diminished and defeated, stripped of the professional authority that had defined his identity. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw no trace of the arrogance that had characterized his betrayal. Cameron understood that his wife, the woman he'd dismissed as a naive obstacle to his new life, had orchestrated every aspect of his destruction with a precision that exceeded his own strategic planning. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Cameron to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release and mandatory restitution of $6.2 million to his victims. The sentence was harsher than even prosecutors had requested, reflecting the judge's disgust with Cameron's systematic exploitation of vulnerable families. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Williams said before pronouncing sentence, "You violated every principle that defines honorable legal practice. You exploited families during their most vulnerable moments, stole from the very trust funds you were supposed to protect, and showed callous disregard for the damage you were inflicting on innocent people." As Cameron was led away to begin his prison sentence, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering his betrayal: complete peace. Justice had been served not just for my family but for every family that Sterling Financial had targeted. The man who had tried to steal his grandfather's legacy and abandon his family responsibilities would spend the next 12 years contemplating the consequences of betraying everyone who had trusted him. 2 years after Cameron's sentencing, I stood in the lobby of a gleaming office building in downtown Seattle, preparing for a meeting that would have been unimaginable during my marriage. The brass nameplate beside the elevator read, "Whitmore Financial Protection Institute," the nonprofit organization I'd founded to help wealthy families defend themselves against sophisticated fraud operations like Sterling Financial. The woman who entered that building bore little resemblance to the Victoria Whitmore who had discovered Cameron's betrayal through an HR termination letter. That woman had defined herself through her relationship to others, as Cameron's supportive wife, Oliver's devoted mother, the perfect accessory to someone else's ambitions. The woman I'd become was entirely self-determined, driven by a mission that emerged from personal devastation, but extended far beyond individual revenge. The institute occupied 3 floors and employed 15 full-time specialists, including former FBI agents, forensic accountants, and family therapists who understood the psychological tactics that financial predators used against their targets. Our client list included prominent families from across the Pacific Northwest, all seeking protection from the kind of sophisticated manipulation that had destroyed my marriage. "Mrs. Whitmore," said Jennifer Walsh, a former federal prosecutor who served as the Institute's legal director, "the Henderson family wants to establish an endowment fund in your honor. They credit you with not only recovering their stolen assets, but with preventing them from being targeted again by similar operations." The Henderson family had become close friends during the past 2 years, bonded by our shared experience of betrayal and recovery. Margaret Henderson, the elderly widow whose trust had been pillaged by Cameron's schemes, had become a fierce advocate for fraud prevention and one of the Institute's most generous supporters. But the most profound transformation wasn't professional. It was personal. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based entirely on my own values and priorities, rather than supporting someone else's agenda. The house in Laurelhurst had been sold, with proceeds funding both Oliver's education and the Institute's establishment. I'd purchased a modern townhouse overlooking the Columbia River, decorated according to my own tastes and filled with books, artwork, and furniture that reflected my authentic preferences rather than social expectations. Oliver had thrived during this period of family restructuring, graduating magna cum laude from Reed College with a degree in environmental law. His senior thesis analyzed the legal frameworks that allowed financial predators to exploit vulnerable families, demonstrating intellectual rigor that made me proud while revealing how profoundly his father's crimes had shaped his worldview. "Mom," Oliver told me during our weekly dinner at my new home, "watching you transform Dad's betrayal into something that protects other families has been the most important lesson of my life. You showed me that victimhood is temporary if you choose to make it temporary." His insight was accurate but incomplete. The transformation hadn't been a choice so much as a necessity. Cameron's systematic destruction of our marriage had eliminated the comfortable illusions that had defined my identity for 18 years. Without the structure of being Mrs. Cameron Whitmore, I had been forced to discover who Victoria actually was when she wasn't serving as someone else's supporting character. The answer had surprised everyone, including myself. Freed from the constraints of maintaining Cameron's image and managing his social connections, I had revealed capabilities and ambitions that had been dormant for decades. The skills I'd developed investigating Cameron's betrayal, attention to detail, strategic thinking, the ability to see patterns that others missed, proved invaluable in helping other families protect themselves from similar predators. The Institute's reputation had grown rapidly, built on successful interventions that prevented fraud before it could devastate families. Our early warning system, developed from Elena Rodriguez's investigative techniques, had identified and disrupted 12 separate fraud operations across 4 states. "Victoria," said Dr. Sarah Kim, the forensic psychologist who led our victim recovery program, "you've created something unprecedented. Most fraud prevention focuses on financial safeguards, but your approach addresses the emotional and psychological vulnerabilities that make families susceptible to manipulation in the first place." The psychological component had emerged from my own experience of recognizing how Cameron's betrayal had been facilitated by my willingness to trust completely and ignore warning signs. The Institute's counseling program helped family members understand how their own strengths, loyalty, generosity, desire to maintain harmony, could be weaponized against them by sophisticated criminals. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my new life was the relationship I'd developed with other women who had experienced similar betrayals. The Institute had become an informal network of survivors who supported each other while working to prevent other families from experiencing the same devastation. Sandra Williams, whose husband's affair I had helped expose during my FBI informant period, had become a close friend and the Institute's development director. "Victoria, you saved my family from losing everything," she told me regularly. "But more than that, you showed me that betrayal doesn't have to define the rest of your life." The financial security that came from controlling the Whitmore Trust had provided freedom to pursue meaningful work without concern for profitability. Edmund Whitmore's legacy, originally designed to support Cameron's moral character, was now funding efforts to protect other families from the kind of moral failures that had destroyed his grandson's claim to that inheritance. The irony was perfect and deeply satisfying. The money that Cameron had tried to steal was now being used to prevent other families from experiencing similar theft. His grandfather's fortune was fulfilling its intended purpose of protecting family legacies, just not in the way that Cameron had expected. But the transformation extended beyond professional success and financial security. For the first time since my early 20s, I was dating again, carefully and selectively, but with the confidence that came from understanding exactly what I would and wouldn't accept in a relationship. Robert Chen, a federal judge who had presided over several sterling financial prosecutions, had been pursuing me with the kind of patient persistence that suggested genuine interest rather than opportunistic attraction. Our relationship was developing slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than the romantic intensity that had characterized my marriage to Cameron. "Victoria," Robert had said during our most recent dinner, "what I admire most about you is that you transformed personal pain into public service. That kind of character doesn't come from easy circumstances. It comes from choosing to grow rather than retreat when life becomes difficult." His observation captured something essential about the past 2 years. The woman who had discovered Cameron's betrayal could have retreated into bitterness and isolation, focused entirely on personal recovery, while letting others face similar dangers without warning. Instead, I'd chosen to use my experience as a foundation for protecting other families, transforming individual trauma into collective prevention. The Institute's annual report, released on the second anniversary of Cameron's arrest, documented protection services provided to over 300 families and fraud prevention education delivered to thousands of individuals. The statistics were impressive, but the individual stories were what mattered most. 3 weeks ago, I received a handwritten note from Maria Santos, whose family had been targeted by a sterling financial copycat operation in California. "Mrs. Whitmore, your institute's training helped me recognize the warning signs when my husband's new financial advisor began pressuring him to restructure our family trust. We avoided losing $2.3 million because you taught me what to watch for." Letters like Maria's arrived regularly, each one confirming that Cameron's betrayal had ultimately served a purpose far greater than his selfish intentions. The destruction he had inflicted on our family had been transformed into protection for hundreds of other families, turning his moral failure into a foundation for preventing similar failures. Last month, I received an unexpected visitor at the Institute, Adriana Cross, recently released after serving 18 months in federal prison. She looked older and humbler, stripped of the confidence that had once made her such an effective predator. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying genuine remorse, "I know I have no right to ask your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your courage in exposing Sterling Financial probably saved my life. Prison gave me time to understand how completely I'd lost myself in that criminal lifestyle." I listened to her apology with the detached compassion that came from complete emotional distance. Adriana's redemption was her own responsibility. My focus was on preventing other women from becoming either perpetrators or victims of similar schemes. As I stood in that Seattle office building, reviewing our expansion plans for serving families across the Pacific Northwest, I reflected on the strange gift that Cameron's betrayal had ultimately provided. Yes, he had stolen our money, destroyed our marriage, and shattered the illusion of our perfect life. But in doing so, he had also freed me from a prison I hadn't even recognized, the prison of defining myself through someone else's achievements and living according to someone else's priorities. The trust fund clause that Cameron had forgotten about had worked exactly as Edmund Whitmore intended. It had protected the family wealth from someone who proved unworthy of that trust. But more importantly, it had provided the foundation for a new kind of legacy, one built on protecting other families rather than simply accumulating wealth. Cameron would serve 10 more years in federal prison, followed by a lifetime of financial obligations and professional disgrace. I would continue building an organization that turned his moral failures into other families' protection. The perfect marriage had been a beautiful deception. The authentic life I was creating was complex, challenging, and absolutely mine. And for the first time in decades, that was more than enough. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.